I want to tell the listener that the stuff that I put out in this series about slavery in the Bible is something you just aren't going to find anywhere else. Not that I've been able to find. Nobody else that I can find is defending the Bible in its entirety when it comes to slavery in the Bible. The critics I always see when I'm researching this stuff are always misrepresenting the commands, and many church leaders are trying to downplay the commands, maybe soften its blow, these commands from God, and teach that those texts just no longer apply anymore. But their plea to forego such commands from God hits a brick wall when you see texts in the New Testament reaffirming the regulations on slavery from the Old Testament. One particular case in point is the letter from Paul to Philemon, where he documents through inspired scripture his actions to return a runaway slave back to his master. The runaway slave, who goes by the name of Onesimus, has been a thorn in the side of many church leaders who feel like they have to engage in some kind of damage control when confronted with the fact that Paul returned Onesimus back into slavery. But I want to approach this from a different angle, because in one of my previous videos, we covered the verse in Exodus, which spoke of a law forbidding Israel from returning a slave back to his master if the slave was trying to run away from his master. And I want to analyze that verse to show that Paul was not in violation of this command when he returned Onesimus back to his slave master. Now, this apparent paradox would be resolved immediately if we can agree that from the tone of the epistle to Philemon, we can safely conclude that Onesimus was not returning to Philemon against his will, but rather was volitionally returning to Philemon at the direction of Paul. But the question is, was Paul's direction towards Onesimus to return going against the spirit of the law in Deuteronomy? Let's look at that command right now. Deuteronomy 23, verse 15 and 16. It says, "You shall not give up to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall dwell with you in your midst, in the place that he shall choose within one of your towns, wherever it suits him. You shall not wrong him." Christians tend to avoid a lot of the slavery passages of the Bible, but they also tend to like this one a lot. And when they quote it, they are quickly met by atheists with a rebuttal, which points out that this particular law was not for all slaves, but was only applicable to foreign slaves, because the secondary portion of the passage I just read to you states that the slave is allowed to pick any place within the towns to live. Something that a native Hebrew would not have to decide, being that they already grew up there. And I think this is a well-made point by the critics, that this verse is specifically referencing foreign slaves is something that I do agree with. Which, just in passing, is funny to me that atheists will recognize this articulated mercy granted to foreign slaves, but those same atheists are blind to the articulated mercies granted to foreign slaves in other parts of the Bible, for example, in Leviticus 25. But moving on, yes, I agree, this is in reference to a foreigner who is escaping from an oppressive master to what in his eyes would be a sanctuary refuge of Israel, but I disagree with atheists that therefore would mean that we cannot apply this principle then to native Hebrew slaves as well. In fact, there are tons of verses in the Bible speaking against Hebrew brother wronging another Hebrew brother. And we can see in the last part of the Deuteronomy 23 passage the reason given as to why Hebrews should not return a foreigner to an oppressive master. Because to sum up the command, God says in verse 16, "You shall not wrong him." The RSV version says, "You shall not oppress him." The whole reason why you shouldn't give an escapee slave back to a tyrant overseer is because to do so would be wronging him or oppressing him. Now, is the atheist seriously arguing that the Bible forbids wrongful oppression of a foreign slave, but on the other hand allows the wrongful oppression of a Hebrew brother? Obviously not. This law is just one of many laws that establish the principle for slave overseers to not be wrongful oppressors to their slaves. And if they were, and the slave should escape from that, Israel was to protect him from the wrongful oppression by making room for him to find another place without returning him to that oppression, whether the slave was Hebrew or foreign. So now, Applying this to Onesimus, we can safely say that if Paul was encouraging Onesimus to return to his slave status in Philemon, it can safely be said that Onesimus was not returning to a wrongfully oppressive overseer, especially when we see the writings of Paul in the beginning part of the epistle speaking highly of Philemon's character and love for those he interacts with. So that Paul was not going against the grain of this Deuteronomy passage by encouraging Onesimus to go back to his slave status with Philemon. I think that's enough to resolve that issue between Deuteronomy and Philemon. But now I want to talk about the ramifications of Paul doing this in the first place. Sure, Paul didn't violate the Deuteronomical command for slaves by sending Onesimus back to Philemon, but it is a very popular viewpoint among Christians to teach that Paul was in violation of every other command in the Bible concerning slavery, and they will say that it was rightfully that way because slavery in the Bible was wrong. They'll point to verses 15 and 16 where Paul says Onesimus is being sent back, quote, that you might have him back forever, no longer as a slave, but more than a slave, as a beloved brother. Now that section, which says no longer as a slave, is focused in such a tunnel vision fashion by modern Christians, and it's used and abused to overthrow just about every other command from God because Christians are so eager to shed slavery out of the Bible and out of their own spiritual heritage that it never once bothers them that their interpretation would necessarily mean they're casting aspersions on God himself, the originator of all those commands they see as unholy and substandard. And they'll use this one verse in Philemon to put the rest of the Bible through this radical makeover. Now, I'm sure the listener actually knows personally many Christians who do just that. But there are other Christians, such as Paul Copen, who I've covered, who will not explicitly outright say that that is their goal, but would rather just practically ignore those other commands of the Bible, only paying them some lip service while focusing in on the passages of the Bible that are more culturally digestible to modern ears, such as this one in Philemon. And going about it this way is, in effect, the same result as the goal of the first group of Christians I spoke of, who would just rather put the Bible through a makeover altogether to throw away and not observe the commands they don't like and only observe commands that they do like, which is the same thing as not following the law at all. But I'm saying neither group has to do any of this at all. Because if they studied the slavery commands of the Bible consistently and diligently, as we have throughout this series, they would find that there is nothing wrong, nothing explicitly offensive about any of them, even to modern ears. Throughout this series, we've surveyed tons of the slavery commands to demonstrate just how right and fair they are, and even how the principles they teach are still practiced in modern institutions today in the West. Not only should they not overthrow God's commands, because it would be an affront on God, but they should not overthrow these commands because the commands themselves are good and right and can be demonstrated as such. But bad interpretations of these passages has caused many Christian leaders to outright misrepresent the Bible, and on the basis of that misrepresentation, try to usurp the commands of the Bible in order to save their own interpretations. In this next clip that I got from Gospel Coalition, you'll hear the speaker say that God condemns slavery in the Old and New Testament, which I'm telling you right now is not true, and she can't prove it to be true with any verse, so instead she moves past the commands of God that undercut her claim, which clearly tell Israel how to do it, and instead she focuses in on passages that are more digestible to modern ears, such as the one here in Philemon. Take a listen.
That we see clearly from the New Testament that there is this command to love others as ourselves, be putting them before us. And there's no way for us to justify slavery in any way and read those texts rightly. There isn't a transcendent hidden ethic that you need to look at in the New Testament to find opposition to slavery there, like some people have said. But rather, it is there. We don't have to read between the lines, I don't think. Rather, the scriptures have really spoken to the text, in the text, that this would be wrong. We cannot enslave people. And enslavement itself is a term that is condemned in both Old Testament and the New Testament. In Paul's letter to Philemon regarding Onesimus, remember that book? I mean, he reveals this great brotherhood that he commands Philemon to value above slavery, above any other way that he would see this slave Onesimus. Brother love and reception as a brother is what he's commanded to do.
Yeah, and what fascinates me about Paul's letter to Philemon, as you say, is Paul uses more specifically loving language when he talks about Onesimus than when he describes any other individual. Now, Paul, as we know, talks a lot about Christ's love and about love in more abstract and corporate terms. But he calls Onesimus his very heart. I mean, the level of affection he had for this guy, and he tells Philemon to receive him as he would receive Paul. So it's not like, oh, well, let him back in as a slave without beating him, as you could have done because he was a runaway slave in the culture of that time. It's not even accept him as a kind of equal. It's receive him as an apostle, as an equivalent to Paul himself. It's this extraordinary inversion of the power structures of the time.
Yeah, and the value that he has put on this man reveals the value that he actually has, the dignity that Paul expects to be given to him. Yeah. So, Rebecca, if we were coming back to the question, how would you respond to someone who asks, what does the Bible have to say in regard to gay marriage?
Okay, two things. In that clip, you heard Rebecca McLaughlin say that Paul was telling Philemon to receive Onesimus back as an apostle. But I think she mistakenly misspoke on that because I find it hard to believe that she would think Onesimus would have had apostolic authority to instruct Philemon. When Paul says to Philemon, hey, receive Onesimus back as he would receive Paul back, he isn't telling Philemon to treat Onesimus as an apostle, but more along the lines of telling Philemon to treat Onesimus in receiving him as a brother, like his spiritual brother Paul. And this segues into my second point, because when Paul says that Philemon should receive Onesimus no longer as a slave, he immediately follows that up with, but as more than a slave, as a brother. It isn't that Paul's declaring Onesimus is no longer a slave to Philemon. Rather, he's saying that he's more than just a slave. He's not merely a slave. In other words, he may be more than a slave, but that doesn't mean he's less than a slave. Rather, he's a slave plus something else. According to Paul, Onesimus is not any less than a slave, but he is also more than that. He is a brother. Paul was not overthrowing the obligations Onesimus has to Philemon. And Paul was definitely not overthrowing the slave commands of the Mosaic Code in saying this. Rather, I would like to submit to the listener that he's actually lifting up the laws of slavery in the Mosaic Code in doing this, particularly in the laws of Leviticus 25, verses 35 through 40. Let's read it now. If your brother becomes poor and cannot maintain himself with you, you shall support him as though he were a stranger and a sojourner, and he shall live with you. Take no interest from him or profit, but fear your God, that your brother may live beside you. You shall not lend him your money at interest, nor give him your food for profit. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan, and to be your God. If your brother becomes poor beside you and sells himself to you, you shall not make him serve as a slave. He shall be with you as a hired worker and as a sojourner. He shall serve with you until the year of Jubilee. Now, when these passages refer to your brother becoming a servant, it's referring to a brother in citizenship to Israel in general, though I think it also can and does include brothers who are of the same blood and kin. It says that no interest is to be extracted from the brother who should not be treated as a slave, but rather as a servant or a hired worker. Here, Leviticus 25 is teaching that the people of God should have a presumption of goodwill on other believers, even the ones that are their slaves, and that this is done by not extracting interest from them on any loan, which, if you'll remember, means they should be granted a presumption of charitable trustworthiness, unless or until they prove themselves to be otherwise, and by not making them pay their brother for food while they are working for their brother until they can get back on their feet or until the year of Jubilee restores them to their assets. Verse 39 articulates what the result of all this looks like when it says that, quote, You shall not make him serve as a slave. He shall be with you as a hired worker. End quote. The thrust of this, in my opinion, is that if he is your brother in God or in kin, you should grant him the charity above that of what you would grant a slave who is an indebted obligation, and to display this affection through these regulated mercies. Bringing that back to Philemon, Paul is applying this very teaching to the relationship between Philemon and Onesimus. And whatever slave-master relationship they had before Paul became involved in it, Paul goes out of his way to make sure this Levitical law is integrated into their relationship by himself voluntarily agreeing to pay off any debts owed to Philemon, so that no extraction of interest comes into play. He says in verse 18, if he has wronged you at all or owes you anything, charge that to my account. In my opinion, the same spirit of Levitical law that says not to treat a brother as a slave, but rather as a servant, is the same spirit Paul is trying to enact when he says to receive Onesimus not as a slave, but as more than a slave, as a brother. Interestingly, Paul doubles down on the brotherly obligation Philemon has to Onesimus by saying in verse 16 that to him, Onesimus is, quote, more than a slave. He's a beloved brother, especially to me, but how much more to you, both in the flesh and in the Lord. Now, I'm not sure if Paul here is saying that Philemon and Onesimus are national brothers or physical biological brothers, but either way, Paul's emphasis on their brotherhood being, quote, in the flesh, is all the more a catalyst to enact these intimate laws of mercy from Leviticus. I think Paul is applying the articulated mercies from Leviticus onto this slave-master dynamic between Onesimus and Philemon as he writes about this situation. I don't think Paul is overthrowing biblical laws of slavery at all in this epistle. I think he's actually following them in the spirit that they were given. Because in other parts of Scripture, Paul never tries to overthrow slavery. Rather, he reiterates it, such as in Colossians, Ephesians, or 1 Peter. These verses, as well as others like them in the New Testament, do not allow Christians to just cast off slavery as a bygone practice of the Old Testament. And so it always comes off as inept every time I see attempts by Christians to say that the Bible doesn't endorse or condone any type of slavery at all. They don't need to hear me tell them that. That's just not true at all, because even a cursory reading of the Bible shows them that. But I do wish I could tell them that they don't need to be ashamed of these slavery commands, because they all can be seen as justly fruitful, even in the modern age. The only reason they are ashamed of them is because of how they've wrongfully interpreted them. And it is their wrongful interpretations that need to be expurgated, not the commands themselves. And I hope in my next episode, I'll be able to give an overview of what we've learned and show some practical applications of how they can be enacted in the modern day.